Is being recorded.
There we go. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wardens and Treasurers Clergy meeting number 40 in the series of meetings that we've had. So this pandemic has drug on a long time, and but we've been able, I think, to expand these meeting sessions out to be more than just pandemic related. We've had opportunities to discuss other issues and then to have some conversation amongst ourselves about a variety of things. And I think one of the best points of this is the opportunity for us to get together and connect with one another and continue to have these conversations as we move through this and other things related to the life of the church. So great to have you all here with us today. And I'd like to open our meeting with prayer. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we give you praise and thanksgiving for the gift and beauty of this day and your never failing presence with us. We pray especially in this November time as we come ever closer to the observance of Remembrance Day. We give thanks for the sacrifice of so many so long ago, for the peace that can be so hard won, and for the call that we have to be agents and ministers of peace, hope, justice, reconciliation in the world. We pray also for our world and the pain and strife that is in so many places, and pray that the healing presence of your Spirit will descend as a healing balm upon all, and that we will become, as we always pray we will be, those agents and ministers proclaiming your good news and the love that we're called to share one with another. We give thanks for the wardens, treasurers, and clergy on this call. We give thanks that we have been entrusted with ministry and mission to care for the people committed to our trust within the Diocese of Ontario. As we continue through this time of pandemic, we give thanks especially for our frontline healthcare workers, for those who continue to work to keep us safe, and for the challenges of these days we commit to you. As always, we proclaim that you are the light and lamp for our path and our feet as we move forward. And in that gracious promise, we always trust. We commend this time to you now. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen. Okay, so just I think we're going to turn this very quickly back over to Alec to take you through. We have put up the draft guidelines for the COVID based on what we've been hearing coming out of the province and moving forward. I think today is an opportunity to go over those, and as I'll leave it to Alec to kind of discuss the process, but the hope of today is to hear from you and to hear your thoughts on this, because as always, we take our cues and our consultation. We have an epidemiologist we consult with the public health units. It's interesting the kind of tried and true path that this has followed when things begin to change within the life of our province and how we deal with it. Usually we find there's a leak that comes out from someone in the province that lets you know what might be coming, and then you have the actual announcement of what is coming, and then there's the regulations that go with it, and we have to pore over those and then get our advice as to how that affects the way that we gather together and the things that we do in the life of the church, and how we're called to respond to that. So we're moving through with the new easing of restrictions and how that might work. And we have those draft guidelines out. So as I say, we really want to hear from you today of your feelings about that, what you're seeing on the ground and hearing on the ground in your particular ministry settings. And then we'll move forward from there. So, and again, just as always, through the other 39 of these calls, I never want to stop my time without offering my word of thanks to you all. These are challenging times, and these latter times are even more challenging because people are so done with pandemic, so done and frustrated with what we have to do, yet the virus is persistent. And I know we just checked some of the numbers this morning at staff meeting, see where we're at across the diocese. And while Hastings, Prince Edward, and Leeds Grenville are still doing relatively well, the numbers in Kingston, Frontenac, Lennox, and Addington have gone in a direction, an unfortunate direction. So we're hoping that having recognized that and what the science table people are saying, I heard some of that today on the news around, concerning trend, but not without ability to be rein back in and get back under control. So again, I think there's frustration across the board, and that in the frustration, we're all in this together with other public, private, nonprofit, charitable, and governmental agencies. So anyway, we carry on. So with that, Alec, I'll toss it over to you, and you can take us through your presentation today. And then, as I say, look forward to hearing from the people on the call today.
Thank you, Bishop. So as the Bishop mentioned, we continue to follow the science. We continue to follow the science both through the epidemiologists that we work with, both through the health units. We talk to the other dioceses, and we, of course, monitor on the internet, because there are, the Center for Disease Control in the U.S. and some other, pretty strong and reputable places to get information. And one of the things that we talk to this every time, but I'll spend just a moment on this, because the difference in how this is transmitted from when we started is one of the fundamentals in this. And so there is a difference between aerosol transmission and droplets. And so, and I think a lot of people kind of think, well, it all comes out of your mouth. It's just, different form. But if you think of droplets and as, more like spit coming out and actually, full droplets, versus aerosol is more like, if you think of it like smoke. And so it's almost the difference between someone taking a puff from a cigarette or a cigar and blowing it out, and where you can see it go, and you can see how far it goes, and it goes quite a distance. I think we've all been in a room where you can pretty much tell when someone has been smoking tobacco or anything else. At the same time, droplets tend to go a little, much shorter distance, and they tend to be in larger chunks. And what they've discovered, of course, is that, and the reason we've eased back on a number of areas, is because the transmission of what they call fomites, which is surface level stuff, is much lower risk than what was believed in the early days of this. And what this is all about what comes from those aerosols. And so again, that's important as we get to some of the changes we're making. It's important as you get through that. So vaccination is obviously a key, and that's one of the things that has shifted in all of this. We sit with, I think it's over 85% of the adult population vaccinated. But again, it's important to remember that vaccination is not the panacea. You can be vaccinated, still contract COVID, and you can still take that and transmit it to someone else. You may not be that sick yourself, but you can transmit it to someone else. May not even be aware that you have it and transmit it. So there's a number of areas that we need to be very conscious of as we continue to move forward. So in the last round, the province created additional flexibility for churches. And this is one of the key points, and it's been one of a key for us that is an inflection point. And that is around requiring proof of vaccination. And we've had a small number of churches who made the decision previously that they would require proof of vaccination, a full vaccination, for anyone to enter the church for worship. And there is the whole discussion around that differs diocese to diocese, that differs church to church. Certain dioceses have taken the view that requiring proof of vaccination is blocking people from receiving the sacrament. And from their perspective, that's not something that where they intend to go. In other cases, it's been gone the other way. So requiring vaccination. So we've done a lot of discussion on it, and as we walk through, really came to the conclusion that in this diocese, we want to continue to be cautious, but we want to allow the churches to make local decisions which fit the circumstance in that church. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. As I mentioned, vaccination is not absolute. Regardless of what vaccine you received, regardless if you've had a booster and you get up to 3 shots, it is not absolute. And so still needs to be caution taken. We are, as I mentioned, going to allow churches to make local decisions. And again, that also means because the health units, I think as the bishop mentioned, KFLA, we are up like over 120 now and seeing the number rise rapidly. And so we already know that there will be much higher propensity for the health unit here to respond differently than Hastings, Prince Edward, or Leeds, Grenville, Lanark, to respond differently. And finally is that we need to continue to be prepared as we go, because we may need to take steps backwards. So I think as you all saw in the document we sent out yesterday, and those who may not have looked at it, it is on the website. There are 2 options. One option is more or less to stay where you are, which is in step 3 with a couple little changes. But that is what we called the open option. That's where the church remains open regardless of whether you prove vaccination or not, with the exception, of course, of worship leaders and wardens, the people that are in the vaccination policy. But for those coming to attend church, that there's no proof of vaccination required. And we're a church, and that decision would come from the wardens and the incumbent. And the wardens, because it is a temporal matter, it is a matter of the building, it is a matter of liability, it is a matter of safety. And for the priest and they would normally, of course, consult with the incumbent or priest in charge. But because it affects worship, it also means that the priest in charge or incumbent has authority. So in this case, it requires the 3, because always wardens must act in union. You can't have 2 wardens disagreeing and a path forward. You have to come to consensus between the 2 wardens, and also with the priest in charge or incumbent. Where you choose to not require proof of vaccination, the rules around capacity being limited to social distancing would remain. The requirement to be socially distant would remain. And all the other things that are in stage 3, step 3, would remain. In churches where the decision is to restrict access to those that can provide proof of vaccination or a proof of a medical exemption, then that allows some of those restrictions to be removed. So it removes the capacity restriction on physical distancing. So whether you've calculated that based on the 2-meter rule, or whether you've done it based on square footage, regardless of how you've done it, percentages, it would now remove that. And it would also remove the requirement to maintain distancing, although we still highly recommend maintaining distancing where at all possible. Because again, what we know with this virus is that it's aerosol driven. And we know that even though you're vaccinated, you could bring it into the church. So maintaining distancing where at all possible is still highly recommended. So that stands there. And it allows for social events for what we're referring to as restaurant rules. However, one thing since we issued those yesterday, as I've continued to work through and gone back through this and sought some further advice, they did make a change in the regulations, and as the government puts it, for greater certainty. So the social gathering rules after a service of worship, whether it's in a funeral, wedding, or a public service of worship, it is still limited to 25 people. If so, that would be essentially a coffee hour. So then these, when they go from draft to final, that will be updated. that the limit is still 25 people, regardless of whether you've required proof of vaccination or not. They are still not allowing that as a exemption, and have added the phrase for greater certainty. We've also had a fair bit of discussion and around frustration from both clergy and from lay worship leaders around the struggle with masks, and more so with the ability to be heard than, of course, personal convenience, because no one would place their personal convenience or preference over the safety of those around them. But so what we are doing is making a change. Now, there's a question that pops up. I think it's already been asked here, but we'll speak to that in a moment. But what this is saying is that at any given time, one person who's leading worship, and leading worship will depend upon the moment in that liturgy. It may be a lay person or a ordained person reading a lesson. It may be an intercessor. It may be the celebrant or the presider. It may be the preacher. But at any given time, one person, and only one person, may remove their mask while they are performing that particular part of the liturgy. They must be distanced by a minimum of 4 meters from the congregation or from anyone else, and they must be behind an impermeable barrier. And we've had questions about whether would that include a face shield. At this point, it does not. What I've been advised by the health unit is that face shields are more viewed as eye protection for the wearer, and unless it's a face shield that creates some kind of seal around, that it's not effective as a barrier. So I'm going to get some confirmation on that before Friday, but at this point, we are still looking at the barrier being a sheet of glass or plexiglass, which would sit either at the lectern, in the pulpit, whatever, that the person would remain behind, and that person would need to remain stationary. So unfortunately, that means those that prefer, for example, to preach from down in the nave, that's not really possible here. But that person, you can remove your mask at that point. And again, looking for further clarity around whether a face shield, and if so, what that's going to entail. You must remain stationary. It also then, if you are behind the altar, that whether seeking or speaking or singing must, when the elements are within 4 meters, you need to remain masked. But of course, behind the altar, without the elements present, that one person with a barrier in place can remove their mask. So that's intended to give a little more flexibility. And again, less so for personal preference for those speaking, but more so for those that may struggle with being able to hear. Formation activities for those that are 12 and older, again, with full vaccination and proof or medical exemption, they can return to the normal capacities. Choir practices, that again, with distancing between people, with mass singers, and as you saw in the specs, limiting rehearsals to 90 minutes, but choir rehearsals can return. The choral ensemble restriction for those that have gone for the restricted option will be increased from 6 to whatever your physical distancing will allow, typically in the chancel area, although in some cases in a gallery. But it will shift from a maximum of 6, and we have heard there's some people that are creative. They may have more than 6 in the choir, but only 6 at one time singing. But that choirs can now, in a church that's elected for the restricted option, can go past that 6 with distancing, with masks, and with that restriction. The other piece that we've gotten clarity on is that fundraising events would basically be treated like retail, and you will be the scale of your hall for a bazaar or a sale would be limited by what the physical distancing capacity of that space is. So that, again, and just like in a retail environment where the stores are required to keep people socially distanced, you would be required as wardens and to ensure that that is in place for example, at a church sale, a bazaar, etc. I'm not going to read the list, but the bulk of the other pieces have not changed. All the other requirements for things like pre-assessment, moving in the liturgy, processions, the collection plates, all those things have not changed. Ventilation, I think one of the things we're hearing is that as they look at the numbers rising, one of the focuses is very clearly around the fact that, well, at Thanksgiving, we had more people come in together and more exposure. Restaurants and bars, there's definitely an increase there. And finally, they're seeing the increase as we move indoors with the weather change, that we know, again, back to this is aerosol transmitted, that as we move indoors and there is poor ventilation, there is a much higher risk of transmission indoors. So ventilation becomes a critical factor. At our next regular session, we're going to spend some more time on ventilation, but I did attach in the appendix to the draft some pieces that we've been given expertise, and some of that came from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, around ventilation. And just noting again that prayer books and Bibles can be returned to the pews. At this time, hymn books, of course, there is still not congregational singing. Although we do appear that I think in a lot of churches you do hear reports that people are mentally projecting their very loudly, but again, we still need to ensure that congregations are reminded that congregational singing is still not permitted. Again, the vaccination policy per se has not changed, other than the incumbent and the wardens making a choice on the open or restricted options. We continue, for clarity, to encourage everyone to be vaccinated, and accept those, of course, who can't be, and that for those people, they consider participating in online activities. And that, again, the importance of continuing online options. So the guidelines were issued yesterday. We are today on Tuesday. And our plan is to take the input from today and from the follow-up with sending out things again for some consultation with some outside sources, and then issuing the final version on Friday, and that Monday those new guidelines would take effect. So the next steps after we finish listening and consulting, the final version, wardens incumbent, we need you, of course, to review this. And again, as we mentioned in the document, it's important to listen to your congregation and sort of be representative of the congregation, not just some of the loudest voices, because typically the loudest voices will come from the two extremes, and a lot of people will be potentially somewhere in the middle. There'll also be a form attached to the final document, and what you'll be required to do is to provide back that form. It will advise what choice you've made, and it will also, particularly if you're taking the restricted option, that you confirm that you understand and accept the regulations, the policies, and the responsibilities that come with that. And again, the local health units, particularly when there are complaints, have shifted a lot of people onto the enforcement side. And so where there are complaints, they are following up. Was in a restaurant just the other day that had just been visited by the health unit. and pushing hard to make sure that their practices on proof of vaccination, on recording, they were really pushing hard for service staff to have goggles on. We've done some inquiries, and it would not be surprising at all, particularly in KFLA, if there ended up being a full requirement for eye covering as part of PPE. And that they definitely encourage it, but it's not required at this point, but that may come. That would affect us at events where food is served. So again, we have to continue to monitor those things. We are still looking at congregational singing. If and when that's permitted, it will be with masks, no question. Part of this is really trying to take this in steps and make sure that we introduce change on a gradual basis. I know everybody is looking to pray twice by singing. We're all excited by that. You know, you're speaking to an organist here, so it's a very difficult thing to stand and not be able to join in, and not particularly as we come. So we're towards the Advent and Christmas season. We'll continue to look at that and hope that if we continue on a path where things are continuing to progress, that we'll be able to get to the point before Christmas anyway of being able to sing in church again with a mask on. At the same time, we need to be prepared that we may end up having to take a step back, and you know, some of the variants that are about and things that happen, or if there's outbreaks. Just for clarity, because you get asked this question a lot about masks. When can we quit wearing the doggone masks? The province has made it clear that their target, if things go well, is March of 2022, and it's the end of March, is the point that they believe they'll be able to stop requiring proof of vaccination and stop requiring the wearing of masks in many public venues. But for example, they still speculated in what I was reading from the province that they would still require them, for example, in public transit. So you're still going to see restrictions, but their goal is, if we continue on the path we're on, that by March, and I think their view is that kids will be heavily vaccinated by then, that there may well be boosters in the bulk of the population by then, that there'll be a further easing. But just when that question comes up, that's kind of where we are. Don't plan on that before Easter. Our next regular session for Wardens, Treasurers, and Clergy is the 18th, 2 p.m. And of course, those meetings, as the Bishop mentioned, aren't just centered around this. This is a special meeting, but we center around sharing on a number of areas. So rather than the usual questions and answers, it's now really, this is more of discussion. What we want to do is listen. We don't necessarily have answers in all areas, but want to hear, want to hear questions, want to hear commentary, want to see if there's areas that we need to provide greater clarity in, if there needs to be, broadening of things. So that's the kind of thing that we'd now like to open up to for discussion. You can either do so. Now, Molly is off sick today. We don't particularly, and we're not concerned that it's COVID, just for clarity. But I believe Wendy is on the line. So if anyone wants to ask questions, I'll be watching the chat as well. But where there are questions, you can either just come online and ask them, or you can go into the chat and we can go from there.
Okay, hello. It's
Hello.
Aunt Hennessy from St. Thomas's in Belleville.
I have
a question about the kitchen. Are we still limited to 2 people? Can we open our kitchen? What's the situation there? If we can feed people, we have to use the kitchen.
Right. Good point, because the rules on kitchen, if you have elected the restricted option, then what will happen, what it will mean is that the rules regarding from the health unit regarding food prep areas are what will rule that. And there are specifics around that, but they are increased past the 2 that we had previously specified. But we'll look to make sure that we clarify that in the specs.
Alex, this is Richard Hetke talking from Napanee.
Hello, Richard.
Hi. Just a quick question. Just thinking about my experiences in funeral homes versus in churches. Funeral home experience is obviously very similar to our church experience when I'm doing officiating at funerals. But one of the differences has always been that I can take my mask off when I'm at the mic, and other people can also. I'm grateful to hear that possibility coming up in our churches. I'm just wondering if the plexiglass is a little bit of overkill. Can we just keep it at 4 meters without the plexiglass, or 4 meters is quite a big distance?
So again, it reflects caution, Richard. It reflects the overkill is an interesting term, but we are reflecting that caution. That the recommendation from the health unit is that if you're removing your mask in an indoor space like this, that you replace that mask barrier with a physical barrier, like an impermeable barrier of glass or plexiglass. So that's we've elected, along with several other dioceses, to go that route.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Alex, it's Frances Smith from St. Andrews in Charlotte Lake. If our church is at restricted capacity, could we have a Christmas service, say Christmas Eve, as unrestricted and check vaccination records for people attending that service only?
So again, one of the things that we talked about in the specs is, and I believe the answer is yes. We have to confirm. The bishop and Wayne and I chat about that, but I would think yes, because one of the things that I know some other dioceses or other parishes have done in other dioceses is that they're contemplating is that a given church may offer 2 options. So for example, your 8 o'clock service may be, because there's not often a lower crowd, it may not be require vaccination. So it might be an open service, but at 10:30, the service might be, that service, it's a restricted and it's proof of vaccination to have the larger capacity. So I think, I don't see why we wouldn't be able to provide that choice, that you would have that flexibility that says at Christmas or for a given event, that, like you may have a major event in the parish, patronal festival or something that's a large event, and you want to increase capacity but still stay without proof of vaccination for the rest. We'll chat about that, but I personally don't see why that wouldn't work.
Okay, thank you.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that, Alec. And just the one caveat, and again, it's a good question, and I think for us to have that conversation about it. But I know one of the issues around going open or restricted is the concern the parishioners have, and the concern for the health and well-being of those within. So if you've gone the restricted route, then to go an open route, you need to make sure everybody was aware, because then the individual could make the choice whether they wanted to attend a service where not everybody they've been proof of vaccination, because that's one of the issues that came up. But again, as Alec has said, we were looking at that in terms of having services on an ongoing basis where there might be a service open and a service restricted like that. But I think I agree with Alec. I think the answer would be yes. It would just be very important to make sure everybody's aware of that, who normally attend church.
I agree, and it will mean some extra work in taking down all of the barriers and putting them back up and cleaning everything after the open service.
Yep.
If I could ask a follow-on question to that, it's Alan Rumsey and Marks. If, for example, the open option was selected for worship in the church itself, but the restricted option was selected for the church hall for fundraising events, for example, would that be would that be allowed under the guidelines?
So again, and understand that churches will always find the subtleties and the nuances in this. One of the pieces in here, and I'll just tie this, Alan, to a question I think James Carson had around, again, as we tighten things in some of the areas around it, the 25-person restriction is going to apply to anything in the hall. And because again, having gone back with greater certainty that in the hall, you're going to have that 25 limit for any kind of social gathering. If it is a retail event, and this is again, where is the line between, but you know, if it is a retail function like a bazaar, then your capacity is driven by the number of people that can be socially distanced. Because it's the same as in the church. It's not the fact that it's a church building, it's the fact it's a worship service that they've changed this. And I realize we've talked about this, it does create inconsistencies, right? That there are inconsistencies, but that's what we're forced to with the regulations. So, because in theory, if you worshiped in your hall, you would have your normal pre-COVID, you know, I'm thinking of St. John's Bath, for example, a service in the hall there of worship would not be limited to 25 people. But in theory, the coffee hour afterwards would be, because it's a social event with a capacity of 25 people. Whereas the service of worship would be whatever the fire code is, as long as you've chosen the restricted option. There are, ladies and gentlemen, inconsistencies. And those are not always driven by the diocese. They may well be driven by the provincial regulations.
Yeah. Now, I guess the point I was trying, if a church wants to put on a bazaar, which is a retail event, and therefore by definition is a restricted option, that doesn't force them to say we have to have the restricted option for worship. That's a separate decision, correct?
Again, we'll have to the bishop, and Wayne and I will need to chat about it, but that to me that makes sense, because it allows you, you know, what you're doing is in the interest of, right, the good of the church and the good of the event, but also the safety of people. You can choose, I believe, I think that makes sense that you would have that option, just like you would with a service of worship, Christmas versus Advent 4.
Thank you.
Alex, it's Dawn Tate, St. James, Kingston. I have a comment. We are privileged to actually have a pandemic prevention coordinator who is a medical doctor and teaches at Queen's. And this is a direct quote. It's just a comment. And well, I'll read it. So he says, "What I do not get is that people can sit cozily together at a table, unmasked, to eat, but the person saying prayers or the homily has to be behind glass, if not wearing a mask. Isn't the 4-meter gap enough?" And I know you've addressed that 4-meter gap. So you've already touched it. I just wanted to get our pandemic prevention coordinator's thoughts added to the discussion. Thank you.
Appreciate that. And we of course, like I say, there are inconsistencies in there. Again, what we're doing now, one of the options we considered, because basically the coffee hour, if you will, social time, is being driven by the restaurant rules. And those rules, by the way, are specific. That doesn't mean no masks. It means that you must wear a mask till you're seated at the table. Once you're at the table, in order to be able to eat and drink, you can remove your mask. And then when you go to get up to leave or go to the washroom or go to whatever else, then you must put the mask back on. So what we're really, on one hand, trying to create the safety for that. They don't give us a choice in the church for wearing masks, right? That is still, and what we're operating under is the guidance that they give around speakers. So again, we are walking a number of lines, and we fully appreciate there are some inconsistencies, and different dioceses end up with different consistencies and inconsistencies. So understand, but appreciate the input. I see a question regarding sanitizing, and again, what I mentioned earlier with what we know is that this is less about fomites and more about aerosol. So the recommendation that the CDC and the health units are sanitize the high touch areas. So that doesn't mean sanitizing the whole church. It means the areas like light switches, the areas like handrails, areas like doorknobs, for example, going into the washroom. The light switch, the doorknob, those kinds of areas where people will be high touch, but you don't need to necessarily go through all the other pieces. And so that will be the guidance there. And so, as I say, we are going to go through and try and make sure that a couple of these areas that we've already gotten input since we issued them yesterday, this is fluid, and we will tie them up and make sure that we are we as consistent as we can be within the government regulations. I just see a question on potentially, yes. The question was potentially you could have 50 people for a service of worship, but once you move into the hall for coffee, you can only have a maximum of 25. Is that correct? Based upon the reading of the government's regulations, that is correct. And in fact, it says for greater certainty. So, yep, that at this point is very clear. We will confirm that with all 3 health units, but that's straight out of the provincial regulation. And trust me, they are just joys to read, just joys. Sharon, I see you. You're on mute. You're muted though.
Yeah,
Thank you.
just so I can relay this back to the coordinators for Lunch by George, if they were to take on inside dining, they would be limited to 25 in the hall for the food program.
And I've asked that question, Laurel, because the food program, I'm reading it like there may be another exemption there, because that's not actually a social gathering. You could, if that's classified like a restaurant, and you would be back to the normal fire capacity of the, but I've asked to be safe. I've asked KFLA specifically to clarify that it would be the normal capacity, not because it's not a social gathering, it's a feeding program.
Thank you, Alex.
Hope to have that by Friday.
We'll wait to hear that. Thank you very much.
There are more nuances to this than more colors to this than Joseph's amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Right. My comment, Alex, was this is Sharon from St. John's in Prescott. We renovated our church a number of years ago so that the front part of the original body of the church has been, we have sliding doorways across, and we conduct our services forward of these doors. Now, if we have extra people, we pull the doors back, and we use the back half of the hall as our social coffee hour and other meetings and that sort of thing. But basically, it's all one big space. So if we have, say, 25 for a service, or if we have 35 for a service, or whatever it is, and then we have to move into the back part of the hall for our coffee, I don't know how we would. I grant you that the numbers have not been that large, so where I think we have to worry about it. But what if?
So and again, I think the way you have to look at it, it's not, and I love what you guys have done at St. John's with the division there. It's not about the building, it's about the activity, and that's kind of important. So the reality is that if a health unit person walked in the building during a service of worship and you had 150 people in the church area, if everybody has been required to show proof of vaccination or exemption, then they're going to go, you are fully compliant. Once the service ends and the coffee hour begins, it now becomes a social activity. And so if the health unit person walked in during that social activity, they're going to say, you're only allowed 25 people. And so that kind of becomes the, and I see ones popped up with coffee in a restaurant, you can choose and all those pieces. But again, the restaurant is governed by a different set of rules. They are very specific in the regulations about social time after worship, and whether that's a rite or ceremony or worship, they call it, and whether that's a funeral, a wedding, or a service of worship. They are very specific about that. So the restaurant rules, and again, this is where some of these things, it gets a little bit goofy, to be honest, because of the way that the rules, and we're fitting into these spaces, but they're very specific about social time after a worship service.
Okay, thank you. Shall I mute myself again?
Sure, always good to keep just because we never know where noise comes from. We have parishioners selecting presents to purchase for children for Christmas. Is this a social activity or a fundraising? Again, I would say that if you have a service of worship going on, right? If the bishop was to walk into your building and recognize that you are worshiping, then that's a service of worship. If it is a activity, so for example, when I was a young child, White Gift Sunday was, I can't remember if it was the first or fourth Sunday of Advent, but White Gift Sunday, we would bring, that was part of the liturgy. That was part of a service of worship. If you're getting together afterwards to have a secret or a Santa thing with kids, or you're doing presents after, that's a social activity. If you're in the hall and you're doing a Christmas bazaar, again, that's going to be a retail activity. And so this is now, the rules are driven by what you're doing, not where you're doing it. I know I sound like a broken record.
Alex, it's Julie Daxon from Brockville.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions. Some of them are simple. A while ago, or not that long ago, I asked about putting the cushions back because we were able to bring the prayer books back to the pews. And I'm wondering if the direction on that has changed. I was told yes, but we would have to clean them every time. And we don't want to clean them every time. So I was wondering if we still had to clean them.
So that is another area where there's not great clarity. But I think at this point, if what you've got is the virus lives for up, particularly on softer surfaces, not as long as heavy ones. So that's really, I would say, we're down to a point now where if you guys are comfortable and people are comfortable sitting on them, we're not going to lay that out in the guidelines. If you're at this point comfortable that those are not going to represent a risk, there's not clear evidence that it's a risk or not a risk, other than that if someone was sitting down now and coughed on it and someone else sat right down and put their hand, there is a low risk potential, but clearly it is low risk.
Okay.
It would certainly be lower risk than sitting with your mask off at coffee hour with someone that is. And again, I want to just remind everyone, if you're concerned about the inconsistencies, the warden's an incumbent, you can choose to set a higher standard. You can say people are not permitted in our church to take their masks off at coffee unless they're just taking a sip and then they put it back. You can choose. We, as we've said in the last guidelines, we set the minimum. You can choose to set a higher bar if that's what you believe needs to be set in your context.
Thank you. My next question is on the assessment questions. We don't have to ask them anymore. Is that correct? We just have to keep them posted, and the congregation is expected to self-assess. Is that the?
Yep. You're so that again that sort of depends on your diligence. You know, part of the responsibility is to ensure that people have self-assessed. And so if you believe that with you need to do that by specifically asking, then that can be a decision you take locally. It is one that, however, if you feel that by just having a sign, the provincial minimum is now a sign. It does not require you to specifically ask those questions.
Okay.
Sorry, one of the other, that reminds me, sorry, just one thing is that there are requirements for signage that post to some of this with, and I will, with that will go into the final version, but there are requirements for signage like pre-assessment that says to remind people of the following things, and masks and those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you. I've had a couple of questions from parishioners. Way back, it might have been even have been before I became a warden, because I became a warden during COVID. There was direction that the parishioners were not allowed to meet in their homes conducting church business. And so I've been asked that question if they are allowed now.
So of course, well, any gathering of social nature is limited to 25 people, right? But if it is I'm not sure what you mean by church business, but if, you know,
Well, I can give you some examples. It would be one is a Bible study, and another one is our justice group.
Mm-hmm. So they are church activities, right?
Okay.
Then again, as we've talked about, it's the activity that drives the safety. It's not the building, right? So a service of worship, whether you're holding it in a church, in a hall, or in somebody's basement or garage, has the same sets of requirements under the provincial law. And so that, again, that's where we fall, is that the requirements are the same. And so a meeting of the wardens in your kitchen by provincial rule has the same requirements as a meeting of wardens in your parish hall. And if you think about the safety level, it is the same regardless, because it's driven by the people and the potential for virus and what you're doing, not by whether you're in a kitchen or a hall or.
So our requirements are, signage, contact tracing when they come in, sanitize, where they have to wear a mask the whole time they're in the building. It doesn't matter what they're doing, if they're doing office work or they're attending a service or a meeting, they have to wear a mask the whole time, and we sit 6 feet apart.
Yep. And in the office here, for example, I'm sitting here without a mask. Wayne is in his office without a mask. The bishop is in his office without a mask. If I get up and go to walk to the bishop's office, I have to put a mask on. If I'm sitting in the bishop's office, we mask up. That's kind of, again, the requirements, and that's driven by the business. There's another set of regulations around how business so your church office is governed under business guidelines, office environments. So as an employer, you have requirements there. So again, this can get complex.
No kidding. Let's see what else I have. Okay, a couple of meetings back, you mentioned in regards to the vaccination requirements, we didn't have to ask people like when the furnace guy comes or the photocopy repairman comes or an electrician comes. And myself, I feel that anybody that comes into the building, if we are applying the vaccination rule, anybody that comes in, especially if they're going to be there for any length of time, should be ask for proof of vaccination, and I'm wondering if we can do that.
I agree. So again, what the provincial regulations do is offer that exemption. There's a list, and furnace contractors would be very much photocopier, repair person, all of those types of things. But again, as the wardens, you have the right to set a higher standard. So you can require that, again, someone, is either wears a mask, that requires vaccination. Those can be set. Now you'd need to work that with the service provider, obviously, to ensure that they do send a furnace repair person that is vaccinated. And most businesses that they're sending people into houses or place of business is obviously focused on that, but you can set, as we said, a higher bar than what's required. We have to at least we've set it where the province has. And there's, again, a list of contractors, et cetera, that do not require to prove it or transient. And again, personally, I think, I'm not sure why you would offer that exemption, but the province has chosen to.
Okay. I think that's all I have for now. I might come on again.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
Somebody else have a question?
Alex, it's Barbara Robinson here from All Saints, South Grenville.
Hi, Barbara.
I'm just picking up on Jenny Van Allen's question around vestry meetings. There's a real concern at St. John's in that some of our very active members are young and they are unvaccinated. And can they attend a vestry meeting? The question Jenny is asking, if all of the social distancing, if they're masked, they're sitting at a distance. And if they can't, how does that work out to the fact that they, oh, no, they can't stay for coffee, right?
That's right.
Right.
So again, we're as we get to vestry season again, because if you actually look, the province is going to take steps along the way. March is kind of the targeted end date. I think it's March the 28th, 2022. But each month, December, January, February, they intend to make some adjustments. And so my hope is that if we continue to see our situation stable and continue to improve, that some of these things will lift, that will allow, for example, that as we hit vestry season again.
I should clarify, Alex, I'm sorry to interrupt there, but I'm using vestry in the term that the congregation has used it. They apply that to their parish council meeting.
Okay.
So it's in your monthly parish council meeting. They would very much like these young people there and participating, but can they? Is the question.
So a meeting with, again, that, so you're talking about a parish business meeting, so it's not worship. Again, you would then be permitted maximum number of people distanced with masks. And again, if the wardens have chosen not to require proof of vaccination, right, and that would be a local decision, then that is an option. The same way they could attend Sunday worship, socially distanced, masked, and all of that. Then again, in a meeting context, again, unless the wardens decided not to permit that, I believe the rules would allow that. I'll do a double check, but I don't, based on my reading of it, I think that option would be there. And parish council is probably a good example.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Reverend Barbara. I was wondering how to phrase that when we talked about that the other night, and I'm glad you did. You hit the nail right on the head to phrase it properly. Thank you.
And again, those are good questions that we need to make sure, A, that we think through and that we try and document them, but also that we get the best advice. But again, I'll always go back to, even if it is permitted under regulation or our policy, that you can always strike a higher standard.
Alex, I've got a question. This is Andrew from Bath with things like wedding receptions or family parties in our hall. Is that a social gathering limited to 25?
That's correct.
And if, let's say we have a meeting like the Lions Club, or if it's an exercise.
So again, any of those things that
some sort of
any of
meeting
those
place.
things that are considered social, my reading of the regulations is those things would have that limit.
Okay, thank you.
And there are again, if you have a group in there doing exercise, there are other rules around exercise that apply to gyms and things like that. That group as a renter would need to conform to those.
Alex, it's Richard Hetke again from Napanee. Just clarifying something. Do we declare ourselves a open option church or a restricted option church, or can we pick and choose events and say this is a restricted option event or an open option event with regards to social gatherings and worship services?
So yes, you can. What we will be asking you to do is just a quick form that says, we are either choosing to remain on the open side and not going at all into the restricted space, or we intend for certain services, etc. But again, what you'll be asked to do, Richard, is confirm that you understand the rules and the regulations around it, not only the diocesan one, but the provincial ones, which are law, to ensure that your conformance is there. That's all. Just to remind the wardens and incumbent, yep, we are signing up to this. But you can pick and choose. That's our current thinking. We'll confirm that. But it would appear that logical to give churches that flexibility to, again, different services, if you can manage that with your congregation, of course.
Okay, so we, essentially have three options: totally restricted, totally open, or a mix and match.
Yep.
Okay.
Unless does that make sense to everybody? I think again, we're trying to give churches the flexibility for their circumstances.
Very good, thank you.
Alex, I'm confused. It's Fred Butler. When we started this, the only way you could be unvaccinated and in the building was for a worship service, period. Now you're saying that's changed?
So we're saying we need, what we have to look at is, again, the provincial regulation.
Yeah, but I like anywhere
it says
with,
that certain people had to be vaccinated for certain roles.
yeah, but if I go anywhere outside of, let's say, going to a grocery store or that type of thing, or garage, if you go anywhere else, you had to be vaccinated to get in the door. And
No, you didn't need. You don't. If you go to the grocery store, you don't need to prove
no,
vaccination.
That's what I mean. But I thought when they've changed the regulation, I thought when this started with unvaccinated, it was for worship service only. Like if we rented our hall, everybody had to be vaccinated, period.
And that when the point of that was, that's part of the question we're talking about here, is if the province is now allowing it, should we? That's some of the discussion we're having here. And again, in terms of where the low bar on that is.
Hi,
for
Alex.
example, AA groups, for example, there was not, AA groups have not had social service functions, have not been required to prove under provincial regulations, have not had to show proof of vaccination for social services related things. That's been the policy.
Hi, Alex. This is Noel from
Hey,
St.
Noel.
John's and St. Albans. Pardon my ignorance. I'm not sure if I missed this or if I just don't understand. So I apologize if somebody's asked this already, and I'm just sort of rehashing this. For social activities, I heard you say there's only a maximum of 25 people. Is that if we're in the open option, or is that also the restricted option?
And that That is irregardless of which option. The option you select only pertains to worship.
I see.
So it, again, I just, this is something I think we need to make sure in the document we make it clear.
Okay.
The exemption for the restricted option is about your service of worship. Your services of worship, you remove the capacity limitations if you require proof of vaccination. That's all. It's not related to whether your worship is in the hall or whether it's in the church or whether it's, you know, that's where the restrictions come, is the activity, not the space.
Okay. Thank you.
Alex,
Yep.
Liz Austin from Gananoque.
Hi, Liz.
Hi. One of the big questions that keeps coming back to bite us is congregational singing and the confusion about that. And it's more confusing now, I think, when you've expanded the ability of choirs, for instance, to a larger number of people. But if we're having social distancing within the church and we're having everybody masked, why are they not also allowed to sing?
Well, again, we're managing risk factors, because it's one thing to have, and obviously usually the size of the choir is somewhat proportional to the size of the church. The cathedral has, for example, a good sized choir, and because they have a large chancel, they can have a large number of singers in the chancel area and in a large building. Whereas some of our smaller churches, you may only have 2 or 3 singers, aerosol related. When you now start having everybody starting to put out, that's the highest risk factor. Now, sorry, I shouldn't say it. The highest risk factor would be without masks on, and we won't be there for a long time to come. So we are gradually reducing risk, but at this point, we are not ready to go there. And you'll find most dioceses aren't either.
Okay, thank you.
But we hope to get there for at some point in Advent if we continue on the trajectory we're on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. But do understand the frustration, and I felt it. I mean, I stood at the back of St. George's when the evensong for at the close of Synod, and gosh darn, it was hard not to let my mouth open. I will admit I might have hummed back there, but it is a hard thing, and it's hard for those that are reading lessons and hard for those that are preaching and celebrating. Those are all hard things, and that's why we're slowly easing things up. But again, one of the things that you hear is the fear from the experts of going too far too fast increases the risk, and then we pull back even farther. This was a lot easier, by the way, when we just closed. So we don't have to worry about all these nuances because you just closed. There is no, right? Or there's 5 people allowed in the church to do an online service. You're closed.
You mentioned Synod, and in fact, I understand that in fact people were singing at Synod, and that has created an even bigger problem because now they say, well, I was at Synod and people were singing. How come we can't sing in the church?
Well, there was people in the choir singing at Synod, and I was in the cathedral.
Yeah, but well.
Right, can we get back to the focus for the churches, because the impact of putting barriers up as compared to a plastic face mask that does control, in essence, the spread of aerosols, which you started with, Alex, is an incredibly labor-intensive piece. And I'm not sure, even after doctors, and I'm not an expert, are saying there's an illogical piece to this. And so I really want the committee to think about that, because the issue for many people is they can't hear well through people speaking with a mask. And whether you're open or whether you're not is immaterial to that. But if you have a 4-meter distance or whatever safe distance where your lectern is as compared to the front of the church where the congregation are, there's an incredible, I won't say illogic because that's not fair, but it doesn't seem I think we're talking about managing risk, and I think the risk is worth it. But that's my opinion, obviously. You know, and
so I would then suggest maybe you try an experiment. And do you know, if you know someone that smokes and you stand 4 meters from them, just over 12 feet, about 13 feet, and someone stands and takes a drag off of a cigarette, pulls it in, and then loudly goes and yells out because you would be, and see if you can smell the smoke.
okay, of course I can smell the smoke. Of course I can.
Then if that smoke, if you can smell that smoke, then the aerosols from that person speaking have the same potential. And that's what this is. So what this is an impermeable barrier. And so what we need to, but
it is not the plastic face mask, an impermeable barrier.
And again, if you look at what's been written around medicine, what they wear in hospitals has, in fact, in many cases has a seal to prevent. And that's not going to solve the problem, because you're going to be speaking right into thing. Instead of speaking into a mask, you're speaking into a piece of plexiglass.
Yeah.
So,
okay. I understand.
I understand the frustration. What we're trying to do is balance risk. And again, we maybe the answer is leaving masks on and not getting into this space. That is an option. I know several other dioceses are going to continue with, is say, nope, you must have a mask.
Okay.
We've tried to put that, but I do understand. The other thing is that, of course, if you've got one barrier at your lectern, that's one barrier. If you've now got a preacher, a lector, an intercessor, you know, and then you need face masks. And again, they need to be individualized. Anyway, we will take that back, David. We do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Question on humming. What I saw was that closed mouth humming. And again, as an organist, there's a difference between an open mouth hum and a closed mouth hum. But you know, so like the difference between ah and ooh. But I think there's a line there, but we've not crossed that line in the specs. But I do know, again, people are. What we're trying to go back to is aerosols. And there are dioceses that are considering things like, you can sing with a mask on, just not very loud. Now, what that means, I don't know, right? It's like, what exactly is loud? What exactly is forceful? Anyway, that's the kind of thing. And what we know is that people struggle with gray areas. We're dealing with these inconsistencies. People don't deal well with gray areas. Understand that. And this is hard, folks. I just, you know, this is hard. Some of this we're taking regulations and trying to make, and then in other places we're trying to do the right things. We're making this as we go.
Alex, can I come back on the social gatherings thing?
Go ahead.
I was just looking at the draft document sent around, and in the table, social gatherings, if you're open, you're limited to 25, and if you're closed, you're unrestricted. It's the old fire department numbers. So I wonder,
that's been corrected. That's been corrected.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So you checked that with KFLA.
I have gone back to I've gone back to all 3 health units, but yep, someone asked that early on, but we do, I mean, obviously we are close to KFLA and we have lots of contacts there, but we do check in with Hastings, Prince Edward, and Leeds, Grenville, Lanark as well, because each health unit, each medical officer of health has their own sets of rules. And by the way, there's provincial regulations under the reopening for Ontario at roadmap regulations, but then the provincial medical officer of health, who we happen to be familiar with in KFLA, has another set of emergency orders. There's a page on the internet that's about 20 pages long, full of various directives, orders, and other thing, emergency this, and all of that has to get disassembled to get back to whatever the new normal is going to be. So yeah, we are constantly weaving through trying to make sense of this. ask me what we do in our spare time. So we are past the top of the hour. Do we have any other? And recognize, ladies and gentlemen, this is like I said, this is difficult stuff because we're one hand trying to make things easier, but in another sense, trying to get the rules clear so that it doesn't get harder. And again, I will still, and no church has to go faster than it wants to. No church has to reintroduce choral options. No church has to increase capacity, any of those things.
I would like to ask a question. It's Sally Cowan at St. Philip's in Milford. We're planning a musical performance by one person for 1 hour in our church. It is a fundraiser, but it will be in a church building. Everyone will be masked, distanced. Contact tracing will be done. Are we limited to 25 people?
So you would be limited under as a performance, you'd be limited to what the social distancing of the church permits.
Yeah, thank
as
you.
Like a concert. So
Yes.
And again, we're consistent in that because it doesn't make sense again to say on Saturday night I can go to a concert and have 100 people in the church, but Sunday morning I could only have had 30. That makes no sense either. But yes, you would have the physical distancing that is required. It's not a service of worship, so you can't go the restricted route. You'll be limited to what your capacity is for social distancing.
Correct. Thank you.
Unless, of course, it's a Tuesday evening after 7 o'clock when there was a full moon on the Sunday, but it didn't rain on the previous Saturday afternoon.
I don't feel like laughing.
Yeah, I know. Well, if I don't laugh, I'll cry, Sally.
There was a question in the chat about the size of plexiglass shield at a lectern or pulpit. Don't think that was answered, but it was a good question.
It is, and that's one of the things that I have asked for clarity around. And again, how that's constructed, and that's again going to be an individual circumstance, but there has to be a minimum size for that. And I've asked that question.
Alex?
Yes.
It's Adele Redding from St. John Sterling. I put a couple questions up because these questions have been coming to me all the time about coffee time. They just want coffee time so bad. So the question, if you do the restricted, I said with the restricted option regarding social event, the capacity is what the hall can handle pre-COVID or 25?
Sorry for the confusion. Again, that got put out yesterday. It changed today after a health unit discussion. So the 25, any social event is 25 people.
Okay.
Right. Okay. And so that's the piece there regardless. Okay. Capacity doesn't change. And if you are going with the restaurant rules, then they must be seated, and they can only take their mask off once they're seated, and when they get back up, they need to put the mask back on.
And that was the other question, because I read something in there, and I don't know if I have this other one you just said, so I have to look at that, when you changed some of the stuff from what you sent out on Tuesday. Okay, because there was something said that they can come up to the counter and get their own food and drink.
That's correct, because there is provision now in the provincial regulations for what is referred to as counter service or cafeteria style is now permitted.
Is now permitted. Okay,
is
so
now
but
permitted.
Again,
yes.
At that though, it would be like one.
Socially distanced. You would need your lineup to remain socially distanced.
Okay, that's what I'm getting at. So we might finesse that and just say a table at a time or something. We might finesse that, but yeah, that was one of the questions that they were asking.
Yep.
And I'm just trying to figure that one out. Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. And that's the shift from before where you had to have the food delivered to the table, had to be served. Yes. And now what the regs allow is they've re-enabled counter and cafeteria type service.
So, and again, at 25, is that again, you're saying social distancing, but can they choose to say, well, fine, we want to be in, and I'm going to use the word bubble. I know it's not a bubble, but I'm going to use it. Can they choose to say, well, we hang out with these people, so we're going to sit at the table with them? Or can it be one long table with us all sitting at? That's not social distancing if we do that.
And again, the bubbling thing is not a matter of capacity. That's how you put things together. And so if you've got a family, they can all sit together at a big table. If you're not within that bubble, then you should be, again, like in a restaurant, you should be distant.
And that's what I'm looking at, is what I see at restaurants. So I think we'll go to card tables instead of big tables. Okay, thank you.
And again, one of the things I'll tell you folks, the one thing I know for sure, this stuff will continue to change. It'll continue to change as the province does their thing, as the health units do their thing, and as we learn more, and as you ask more questions and you find stuff out, there'll be greater clarity. Things will continue to change. I'm as sure of that as I am in the resurrection. So Bishop, can we turn back to you for any closing comments? Thank you, Sharon. You're on mute, Bishop.
Thank you very much. I like the sign, Sharon, that you put up, and I want to just reiterate that as well, Alec. Thank you very much. Alec kind of takes lead on this for all of us and is dealing with epidemiologists, health units, weekly or bi-weekly calls at this point with the executive officers from across the province. We take consultation in a wide variety of areas. Different decisions are being taken in different contexts. So thank you very much, Alec, for putting that all together and helping us through this. And thank you all very much for your questions and comments. This was, we wanted to hear from you today on these draft guidelines so that we can take what was said here today, ask the questions we need to ask of the people for whom we need to ask them, and then finalize the document to go out. As Alec pointed out, it's probably a lot easier if it's just a question of we close and we can have up to 5 people, and things are a lot simpler then. And we're trying to work through these kinds of decisions. It is a challenge. The 3 things that are in my mind always are about that are important. I try to boil these down for me simply. It's about masking, distancing, ventilation. Those are the 3 keys that keeps coming out all the time from the healthcare experts that I listen to. The other thing that's always on the top of my mind is there's always the balancing that happens, and I know the province has to do their balancing. When I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about the demographic we most serve, and that demographic is always in the highest risk area. So that is always very much top of my mind as we're making these decisions as well. So thank you so much for what you do, excuse me, in terms of the leadership that you're taking in this for what we had today. And so let us all close now and move on with our days by saying the grace together. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all you're doing. These are challenging times, and you're doing amazing work.
Thank you, folks. We'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Alex, for all you do, and keep.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, folks.